Chapter 23 ended with a deceptively simple instruction. Begin day 1. Select a boundary. Define the outcome. Send the probe. That instruction brought the argument of this book from governance theory to operational practice. Instead of launching another transformation program, the organization begins learning from a real boundary, using real evidence under real operating conditions. Assurance becomes something the organization does continuously rather than something performed after the fact. Chapter 24 now brings the entire journey together. Throughout this book, we have examined governance, resilience, assurance, and accountability from many perspectives. We have looked at boundaries, value streams, minimum viable capabilities, QOQM logic, culture, ecosystems, stewardship, and thin-slice learning. Yet beneath all of those ideas lies a more fundamental problem. Organizations often lack a common language for understanding themselves. Boards speak strategy and risk. Projects speak milestones and budgets. Compliance speaks of controls and findings. Operations speaks of incidents and service levels. Each language is useful, but each describes only part of the system. The final proposition of governance by assurance is that assurance can provide the connective language among them. Not assurance as an audit function, not assurance as a certification, and not assurance as another report. Assurance is a way for leadership to ask whether the organizational beliefs about itself are supported by evidence of how the system actually behaves. That is where we end this journey. With assurance not merely as something an organization produces, but as a language through which leadership learns to govern. The subtitle on this slide captures the destination: moving from disconnected reporting silos to a unified, evidence-based governance system. Most organizations are not suffering from a shortage of information. In fact, the opposite is often true. Leaders receive enormous quantities of data: dashboards, risk reports, project updates, audit findings, compliance attestations, operational metrics, customer measures, and financial reports all compete for attention. The problem is that those information streams frequently describe different versions of reality. A project can be green because it is on schedule and within budget. Compliance can be green because the required controls are documented and tested. Operations can be green because service levels remain within tolerance. And yet the organization can still be fragile. The weakness may exist in the relationships among those perspectives. A project may introduce a dependency that operations cannot sustain. A compliant control may behave differently under pressure than it did during testing. An operational service may meet its SLA while quietly consuming the resilience margin needed to survive the next disruption. The circular image on this slide is useful because assurance should not be imagined as another vertical function sitting beside governance, risk, compliance, or operations. It is connective. Assurance asks whether the claims made in one part of the organization remain true when viewed against evidence generated elsewhere. That is what makes assurance potentially a language of leadership. It gives different roles a way to talk about the same living system without requiring them to abandon their specialized responsibilities. The question is no longer simply, what does my function report? The question becomes, what does the evidence tell us about the system we are collectively responsible for governing? This slide makes the fragmentation visible through three familiar dialects. The project dialect speaks in milestones, budgets, delivery dates, and feature counts. These measures answer legitimate questions. Are we progressing according to plan? Are resources being consumed as expected? Are promised capabilities being delivered? The compliance dialect speaks differently. It focuses on framework coverage, audit findings, control status, and certification cycles. Its questions concern obligations. Are the required controls present? Can compliance be demonstrated? Have findings been remediated? Then there is the operations dialect. Operations talks about uptime, incident counts, response times, and service level agreements. Its attention is on the behavior of the service today. Is it available? Is it performing? Can problems be resolved quickly enough? None of these dialects is wrong. The problem is that they are structurally isolated. Imagine a major digital initiative that is delivered on time and within budget. The project dialect says success. The required controls are implemented, and the audit finds no significant exceptions. The compliance dialect also says success. Operationally, Availability remains above the contractual SLA. Operations says success. But suppose the new service has created a critical dependency on a manual recovery process that has never been tested at production scale. Which dialect tells leadership that story? That is the governance gap. The organization has reports about its parts, but it lacks a common language for reasoning about the behavior of the whole. Assurance closes that gap by asking a question that can travel across all three domains. What outcome are we depending on? What must the system be capable of doing to protect it? And what evidence tells us whether that capability is real? Once that question becomes common, the dialects do not disappear. They become connected. Major failures expose the weakness of disconnected language, because the questions that matter during a crisis differ from the ones organizations normally report. Before the event, leadership may ask, "Are we compliant?" That question has value. But in the first hours of a serious disruption, compliance alone cannot tell leaders whether the organization can continue operating safely. The crisis question on this slide is much more consequential. Can we safely degrade or sustain the critical service until we recover? Notice how many parts of the organization must contribute to that answer. The project view may indicate how the service was designed and which dependencies were introduced. Compliance may tell us which controls were expected to operate. Operations can describe what is actually happening now. Risk may understand the tolerance boundaries. Business leaders understand which outcomes cannot be sacrificed. But someone must connect those perspectives into a decision. That is what assurance language enables. Under pressure, the distinction between a documented capability and an actual capability becomes unmistakable. A recovery plan may exist, but has the fallback mode been exercised under realistic load? A control may be present, but what happens when operators bypass it to keep the service running? A supplier may meet its contractual obligations, but can the shared value stream survive if that supplier degrades? These are not compliance questions or operational questions in isolation. They are system questions. Major failures, therefore, reveal something true before the failure occurred. The organization always needed a shared language. The crisis simply made the absence visible. The objective of governing by assurance is to create that language before the crisis forces leadership to invent it under pressure. This slide captures one of the central ideas of the entire book. Assurance is not an audit department, nor is it a static set of reports. Instead, think of assurance as an ongoing loop between organizational claims and system behavior. Every organization makes claims about itself. We can recover within 4 hours. We protect sensitive information. We can continue serving customers when a supplier fails. We escalate critical risks quickly. Our people speak up when something looks wrong. Those claims may appear in policies, strategies, control descriptions, resilience plans, regulatory submissions, or executive presentations. But the claim is only one side of the loop. The other side is behavior. What happened the last time the system was stressed? How long did recovery actually take? What happened when the primary supplier failed? Did people escalate uncertainty early? Or did they wait? Did the control continue to work when operational pressure increased? Assurance closes the loop by comparing the claim with observable evidence. That is why this slide uses an infinity-shaped flow between organizational claims and system behavior. Assurance is not a one-time validation. The organization acts, evidence is generated, leadership learns, the system changes, and new evidence is produced. The loop continues. When the claim and behavior align, confidence strengthens because it is grounded in evidence. When they disagree, assurance has also succeeded. It has revealed something the organization needs to know. That distinction matters. A mature assurance system is not designed to prove that leadership was right. It is designed to make divergence visible while there is still time to act. GBA gives structure to that continuous inquiry. Governance asks, what are we trying to achieve and what is acceptable along the way? That establishes intent. It defines outcomes, boundaries, trade-offs, and tolerances. Governance tells the organization what matters and where leadership is willing, or unwilling, to accept uncertainty. Resilience asks a different question. How does the organization respond when reality does not cooperate? Plans inevitably meet conditions they did not anticipate. Suppliers fail. Technology behaves unexpectedly. People improvise. Demand changes. Resilience is revealed in what the system does when the assumptions behind governance encounter the real world. Assurance then asks, how do we know that the capabilities we rely on are real in practice rather than simply described on paper? That is the evidentiary discipline. It connects intent to observable behavior. Finally, accountability asks what changes as a result of what has been learned. Without accountability, assurance can identify a weakness indefinitely without changing the system. Someone must have the authority and responsibility to act when the evidence shows that the current arrangement is no longer adequate. These four perspectives are not sequential departments. They are a continuous inquiry into the same system. What do we intend? What happens under pressure? What does the evidence tell us? What will we change? Then the cycle begins again. When leadership adopts that language, frameworks and policies no longer appear as separate governance topics. They become tools for understanding one underlying organizational system. That is the shift from managing governance activities to governing through assurance. The CPD model gives us another way to understand the same system. Organizations must continuously create, protect, and deliver digital business value. Create represents growth and strategy. The organization must innovate, pursue opportunities, introduce new capabilities, and adapt to changing expectations. Protect represents safety and risk. Value cannot be sustained if the organization ignores the conditions that can destroy trust, compromise information, disrupt services, or create unacceptable harm. Deliver represents daily execution. Strategy and protection mean little if the organization cannot reliably produce the outcome for the customer, citizen, partner, or mission. A common mistake is to treat these as competing priorities. Growth wants speed. Risk wants caution. Operations wants stability. But the diagram on this slide shows something different. At an important boundary, all three obligations converge. Consider the release of a new digital service. The organization is creating value by introducing the capability. It must protect that value by understanding the risks created by the change. And it must deliver the value through a service that works under actual operating conditions. Those are not three separate conversations. There are three dimensions of the same obligation. The boundary is where leadership can see whether they remain aligned. This is why assurance matters to the CPD model. Evidence from the boundary tells us whether strategic intent, protection expectations, and operational performance are producing the same outcome. When they are aligned, the organization can move with greater confidence. When they diverge, assurance makes the trade-off visible before the organization mistakes local success for systemic success. If assurance becomes a language of leadership, one of the first things that changes is the quality of boardroom questions. The slide contrasts narrow checkbox questions with evidence-based system questions. Take compliance. The old question asks, are we compliant with the new standard? The assurance question asks something more useful. For our most important value streams, what outcomes are we trying to protect and how do we measure them? Compliance has not disappeared. It has been placed in context. Now consider metrics. The old question asks whether incident numbers are trending downward. A declining number looks reassuring. The assurance question asks where the evidence shows that performance improved because the organization changed how it works, rather than because it was simply fortunate. That is much harder to answer, but it is far more valuable. Finally, consider controls. The old question asks whether the required controls were implemented at the interfaces. The assurance question asks where governance, operations, and culture disagree about what is happening and what is being done about it. That question seeks divergence. This is an important leadership habit. Weak governance often rewards confirmation. Leaders ask questions that enable the organization to demonstrate that expectations have been met. Assurance-oriented governance deliberately searches for the places where the story does not quite fit. Where does the metric conflict with experience? Where does the documented process differ from actual work? Where does a green dashboard coexist with recurring workarounds? Those are not embarrassing exceptions to be hidden. They are valuable signals. The board does not need more operational detail. It needs questions that reveal whether the operating story is coherent. Better questions require structure, and that is where curriculum logic becomes important. The logic tree begins with top-level strategic intent. Leadership may say that a critical service must remain available, that customers must be protected from a particular harm, or that a strategic initiative must produce a defined business outcome. Those statements are necessary, but they are still broad. The next step is to translate strategic intent into questions. What must remain true? Under what conditions? At which boundary? What would cause leadership to reconsider the current approach? Those questions then branch into outcomes. An outcome describes what the system must actually achieve at the operational boundary. This is where vague aspiration becomes something observable. Finally, outcomes connect to measures. Measures provide the signals needed to determine whether the outcome is holding, drifting, or failing. This hierarchy matters because organizations often begin at the bottom. They inherit hundreds of metrics and then try to determine what the dashboard means. QOQM reverses that logic. Begin with what leadership needs to know. Define the outcome that would answer the question. Then identify the minimum evidence necessary to determine whether that outcome is occurring. That creates traceability from strategic intent all the way to observable behavior. And it gives assurance structure. When a measure moves, we know which outcome it informs. When an outcome drifts, we know which leadership question is affected. When the question can no longer be answered with sufficient confidence, governance knows where to direct attention. The boundary is where that entire chain meets reality. It is where governance intent and operational behavior either converge or begin to pull apart. One of the strongest tests of an assurance artifact is whether it carries genuine information about the system across different roles. This slide illustrates that idea through a boundary decision record. The board may review the record and ask whether the decision aligns with strategic intent and the organizational risk appetite. The platform owner approaches the same evidence differently. Did the change do what was expected? What did actual system behavior reveal? Risk and audit may ask how the decision fits into the broader pattern of risk management over time. A regulator may ask whether similar decisions are made consistently, and whether the evidence demonstrates a functioning governance loop. For users, for responsibilities, one underlying evidence base. That is very different from the conventional reporting model, in which each audience receives a separately translated version of reality. Translation is sometimes necessary, but every translation creates an opportunity for meaning to be compressed or lost. Operational complexity becomes a management summary. The management summary becomes an executive score. The executive score becomes a dashboard on the board. Eventually, the original evidence can disappear behind layers of representation. Systemic evidence preserves the chain. The board does not need raw telemetry, and the regulator does not need every operational record. But both should be able to trace the claim back to the evidence that supports it. That is why the phrase on this slide matters. One artifact for use is one language. The artifact earns its place not because a governance process requires it. It earns its place because it carries meaningful information about how the system actually behaved. Culture has appeared throughout this book, because no governance system can be understood by examining technology and formal process alone. Organizations frequently describe culture using adjectives: collaborative, transparent, accountable, innovative, risk-aware. Those descriptions may express genuine aspirations, but they are difficult to assure. The more useful question is, what behavior does the system produce? This slide takes us below the waterline from declared culture to observed culture. Look first at escalation speed. When people encounter uncertainty, do they raise it early, while there is still time to respond? Or do they wait until the problem becomes undeniable and visible outside the team? That behavior tells us something about the real consequences of speaking up. Next, consider near misses. Does the organization examine a near miss with the same seriousness as it applies to a full incident? Or is the absence of visible harm interpreted as evidence that nothing needs to change? A near miss can be extraordinarily valuable assurance evidence because it reveals a failure path before the organization pays the full price. Then consider exceptions. When people bypass a policy or control to keep work moving, does that exception leave a trace in the assurance system? Can leadership see the recurring pattern? Or does the workaround disappear into local knowledge? These behaviors are culture-made observable. This is why the human system and technical system cannot be governed separately. A technically sound control can fail because the organizational environment encourages people to bypass it. Conversely, an adaptive team can preserve an outcome when formal mechanisms fail. Assurance gives leadership a way to see both. Culture stops being a statement about who we believe we are and becomes evidence about how the organization actually behaves. What happens if these ideas become normal organizational habits? The answer is not to create a larger assurance department. The change is more fundamental. When reviewing initiatives, teams begin treating assurance design as seriously as budget and timeline. Before implementation, they ask what outcome the initiative is supposed to improve, what boundary it affects, and what evidence will demonstrate that the change worked. Incident reviews also change. Leaders stop asking only whether the incident was resolved and the action items were closed. They ask where the system learned, where it failed to learn, and whether the response produced a genuine change in the operating pattern. External reporting becomes different as well. Instead of presenting regulators or stakeholders with disconnected artifacts, the organization can tell a traceable story from strategic intent through QOQM structures to daily operations and observable evidence. Perhaps the most significant change, however, occurs internally. Honesty about the system becomes safer than pretending. Near misses become valuable because they provide inexpensive evidence about potential failure paths. Exceptions become signals rather than embarrassments. Uncertainty can be surfaced earlier because leadership has demonstrated that bad news is useful when it arrives in time to support a decision. That is what a learning system looks like. Not a system without failures. Not a system in which every indicator remains green. A system in which information about weakness moves quickly enough to the people who can act, and where action produces evidence that the system actually changed. Over 3 to 5 years, those habits compound. Eventually, assurance is no longer something the organization performs only periodically. It becomes part of how the organization governs itself. A change this fundamental can sound daunting, but the first steps are deliberately practical. The first action is to modify forum questions. At the next board, executive risk architecture or operational review, do not ask only for project status. Ask for one outcome, one measure, and one boundary where meaningful learning occurred during the period. That small change redirects attention from activity toward evidence. Second, incorporate CPD language. When discussing a decision, ask how it influences the organizational ability to create, protect, and deliver value. This exposes trade-offs that functional language can hide. A decision that accelerates creation may weaken protection. A protection mechanism may unintentionally damage delivery. CPD makes those relationships discussable. Third, examine one value stream. Do not attempt to map the entire enterprise. Choose one consequential value stream and look at it through GRAA. Where is governance intent expressed? Where must resilience appear? What assurance evidence exists? Who is accountable when the evidence shows drift? That exercise often reveals operational realities that an executive dashboard cannot. Finally, make one visible decision based on assurance. Postpone a launch because the evidence at a critical boundary is not trustworthy. Change an operating pattern because a near miss revealed a weakness. Recognize a team for surfacing uncomfortable evidence, rather than simply rewarding it for closing findings. Visible decisions matter because they reveal what the organization actually values. If leaders say evidence matters but continue to reward schedules, appearances, and green dashboards above all else, behavior will not change. The shift begins when people see that honest evidence affects real decisions. This final slide brings us to the end of governance by assurance. Organizations invest enormous amounts of time and money in frameworks, technologies, policies, certifications, dashboards, assessments, and transformation programs. Those investments can all be useful, but when they become disconnected from the living system's behavior, they can produce what this slide calls borrowed confidence. Borrowed confidence feels reassuring because someone else has provided a framework, a certification, a score, or a statement of compliance that tells us the organization should be safe. But resilience cannot ultimately be borrowed. It has to exist in the system. Authentic resilience comes from an organization that knows what it must be capable of doing, understands where its critical boundaries are, observes its behavior honestly, and changes when the evidence shows that its assumptions no longer hold. That is the thread connecting everything we have explored. Governance establishes intent and acceptable boundaries. Resilience is revealed when reality challenges those intentions. Assurance provides evidence about what the system can actually do. Accountability ensures that learning becomes action. The CPD model keeps create, protect, and deliver connected around the value the organization exists to produce. The minimum viable capabilities help us identify what the system must be able to do. QOQM gives leadership a disciplined way to move from strategic questions to outcomes and observable measures. Boundaries show us where intention meets reality. Thin slices give us a safe way to learn. And culture tells us whether the human system will allow uncomfortable evidence to travel to the people with the authority to act. None of these ideas promises certainty. That was never the objective. Complex organizations operate in changing environments. Technology will fail. Assumptions will become obsolete. Suppliers will disappoint us. People will make mistakes. New risks will emerge. Conditions will arise that no policy writer, architect, regulator, or executive anticipated. The leadership challenge is therefore not to build an organization that cannot be surprised. That organization does not exist. The challenge is to build one that is harder to surprise. A system that detects weak signals earlier. A system that knows which outcomes matter. A system that can distinguish documented capability from demonstrated capability. A system in which evidence moves across organizational boundaries without losing its meaning. A system in which people can expose fragility before it becomes failure. And a system that learns quickly enough to make the next operating cycle stronger than the last. That is the ultimate legacy described on this slide. Not a list of completed projects. Not a shelf of certifications. Not a perfectly green dashboard. The legacy is a living organizational system that knows how to ask better questions, take honest stock of the answers, and act on what it finds. That is what it means to govern by assurance. And that is how assurance becomes the language of leadership.